Watch the ride.
Hey everybody, this is going to be a video about general motorcycle maintenance. Thanks to my sponsor AutoDoc for this video, more on them later. Okay, so general motorcycle maintenance, stuff that I get asked this all the time. What should I be doing regularly on my bike to make sure it keeps it in a good condition and safe to ride? And it isn't really difficult, there's not a lot to it. It's just making sure you do these few things. I tend to think of the bike in two halves, a lower half and an upper half. So we'll start with the lower half, starting at the front. Tyres. Check the tyre for any nicks, any cuts. Check to see how much tread you've got left, make sure it's legal. You have these tread indicators, and as you can see, I have a little bit to go, but not a huge amount on this front tyre. Then continuing on with the front, hold the bike's steering still and give the wheel a little wobble backwards and forwards. And if you can feel a knock without anything else but the wheel moving, if you can feel like a little in there, your front bearings are gone and you need to replace those. Not particularly difficult, not particularly expensive, but it is important that you check these things. Brake discs have a minimum thickness and it will be marked on them, so you have to measure them with some micrometers or some verniers or even with a ruler that's accurate enough, and measure how thick the disc is, because once it gets down to that minimum wear, you need to replace your disc. And the same can be said for your brake pads. You need to keep an eye on those and make sure they've got enough meat left on them. They should have wear indicating grooves as well. And the last thing to check on the front is your suspension stanchions. See if there's any rusting, any corroding, see if there's any oil leaking, because you have a seal just inside here. There's a bit of tape left from where I did this up at Christmas. There's a seal inside here that if it leaks the oil from in here, it will run down your fork tubes and your suspension will come very springy without any dampening, because that's what the oil in these is doing. If you make sure there isn't any on here, then you know your seals are still working fine, which mine are, thankfully. Tyre pressures as well. Very important to make sure your tyre pressures are correct. If they get more than a couple of PSI low, you'll start to notice differences. So continuing with the lowness, engine oil. You need to be changing the oil within regulation of what your manufacturer suggests. This bike, being a single cylinder and a large one at that, you have to change the oil every 1,000 to 1,500 miles roughly. Other bikes can go for 5,000. It all depends on how hard they run and what they suggest for the type of engine. But changing the oil is not particularly difficult. You've just got to pull a sump plug and put some new oil in there. The other thing at this point is the radiator. Make sure that you have enough fluid in there, make sure that it has enough antifreeze in it. There's normally a filler point up here somewhere. You should also change that periodically, flush the whole system out and put new stuff in. But that is something you do maybe yearly, every couple of years, depending on how hard, again, the bike is run, and obviously the condition of the coolant and the amount that's in there. One other thing while you're in the middle here is obviously the engine will have a filter, an air filter for the intake. You want to make sure that that's clean, not overly blocked. Some you can actually clean out and you can wash them, others need to be replaced. They're not particularly expensive, but it is good to keep an eye on that and change it as and when they look dirty, because it will restrict the flow of air to your bike and it will starve it of air, and it won't be able to perform as well because it won't be able to breathe. Now this isn't something you have to change particularly regularly, and it isn't something you're going to want to play with if you don't know what you're doing, but on motorcycle engines they have a cam chain normally and they have a tensioner. It's either automatic or manual. On mine, I fitted a manual one on because the auto one was known for causing problems, but it means that if the cam chain starts to loosen, it's not going to automatically take up that slack. There is literally a chain running top to bottom and there's a guide on it here. And you have to adjust that. You'll know your cam chain is loose because you'll be able to hear this little noise that you wouldn't normally hear from the engine. It's different on different models, but generally in single cylinders anyway, it's just this noise, like a tapping running sound on that side. As I say, it's very periodic and you only need to adjust that when it needs to be adjusted. And don't try and do that if you don't know what you're doing, because if you over tighten it, you could snap your cam chain and then you end up having your pistons and your valves meeting in the middle, and yeah. So don't mess with it if you don't know what you're doing. Also periodically, the valves should be checked on a motorcycle to see if they were within spec. And they are normally adjusted either with a screw or with a shim. But again, that's quite a complicated job. That's not normal maintenance, but it is periodic. Every couple of years you should have your valve clearances checked and adjusted if needs be. But that's pretty much everything to do in the engine. So the two things you need to really keep on top of is oil, absolute number one, and the coolant. Beyond that, it's much more periodic. Okay, so moving back, you then have the suspension. You want to check that that isn't leaking any oil. You want to make sure that it is compressing properly and there's no looseness around this. You've also got a lot of bushings in this area to do with where the swing arm attaches to the engine. Now, one of the ways you check this is you get the bike, if you can get a panic stand for your bike, or if you can lift it up on the side stand, that's kind of how you have to do this. You want to get the rear wheel off the floor and you want to try and pull it up. Now, if it's got a little knock, like an easy bit of movement, it's like knock, 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 and then it's harder, it means you've got some worn bushings and they need to be replaced. If there's excessive movement in them, it will be an MOT failure. However, depending on where it is, not particularly expensive or difficult to do if you can do it yourself, but pressing them in and out of the swing arm and having to take the swing arm off to do it could be above some people's abilities, but the point is it's something you have to periodically check. Again, obviously, the exact same thing applies to the rear. Check your tyres, or if you have a spoked wheels, that's another thing, make sure that all your spokes are evenly tightened. Don't go to adjust them yourself. It's a skilled job to make sure that a wheel runs true through the tension on its spokes. But these are so strong, these ones. I haven't had a problem with them at all. So exactly the same with the front. Check your brakes, check your brake pads and brake discs. And again, check your bearings and everything like you would with the front. Exact same way, give it a wiggle. One of the things that you need to keep on top of the most on a motorcycle is the chain and the sprockets. These wear with time and you have to adjust the chain further back by moving the wheel backwards to keep the tension on. If it's loose, it can snap, it can get more damaged more quickly, and it can also fly off and cause a rear wheel lock-up and all sorts of nasty things. It is known for chains that snap to, when they come around this way, they whip the inside of the engine casings and can actually smash holes into your engine. So you really don't want to mess around with your chain. It should be clean and well lubed, not overly lubed. Again, check out videos for your bike, check out your instruction manual, it's exactly how you do that. This bike needs to be on the ground on its side stand to check the chain. That's something to mention here, because what happens is, and I have a video on changing sprockets and chains, it's quite old. Basically, depending on where the suspension is, it'll be looser or tighter. So if you adjust it for being on the flat, you then need to check with you on the bike, because when the bike goes down, it puts tension on the chain. If you haven't got enough slack there, because I've seen people who've adjusted them to like an iron bar, when they get on it, it's going to be doing huge damage to the bearings and putting a lot of excess strain on the chain. You want to make sure there's enough slack, which is within spec for that bike, and then test it with you on to make sure that it isn't going solid. It needs to be just a little bit of movement when you're sat on it. But as I say, you'll find a video on that for your bike or your instruction manual. It's not particularly difficult. There's a few different methods of how you move the wheel backwards, but you need to make sure that that is equally backwards at the same rate so the wheel isn't out of alignment like this. Most bikes have got witness marks on the swing arm. Generally, you can't trust them. I'd rather use a pair of verniers and measure the thread that comes out the back or a gap somewhere that I can correspond to the other side to make sure that the wheel is exactly in the middle. Also keep an eye on your sprockets, because what they should have is a nice U shape in for each cutout, of the sprocket with each tooth. You don't want those to look waved, because that means they're very, very worn, and if you've got any that are broken off, it's no good, you have to change it. Another thing to mention is you don't ever put an old chain from something else on your bike, you don't put a new chain on old sprockets. Every time that you replace a sprocket or a chain, you should really replace the chain and the sprockets at the same time. Thankfully, unless you have some accident that damages one of them, they normally wear about the same rate. And by the time that the chains, you're out of adjustment, your sprockets are getting a bit old anyway, so it's time to change it all. But that is very high up in the priorities, just like the brake pads and discs. That is the majority of general maintenance on the bottom half of the bike. I think you can see now what I'm talking about here is the bottom half being the wheels and the suspension and the engine. It's kind of the working side. Like, this is the bike side, everything above that is like your side. And we'll move on to that in a second. Obviously, a lot of what I'm saying here applies to cars as well. You still need to check your brake pads, you still need to check your bearings in a very similar way. You get it jacked up and you give it a wobble. If you've got a wheel bearing that's gone, it's gonna knock and things like that. And if you need parts for your car, then AutoDoc.co.uk, there is a link in the description, are perfect for you. They've got a huge selection of parts, good prices, and they're very kind for sponsoring this video so I can bring this to you. I've seen that they have a UK and a European website, so if you're in the EU, check out the European site. If you're in the UK, check out the UK site. As I say, link is in the description. And having had a look at their website, it seems to be pretty good. So check them out, and thanks to them for supporting this channel. Okay, so now carrying on with the top half, which is kind of your half, and there's not a lot to go on here really. But number one, out the front, bulb. Make sure that your headlights are working, make sure none of your bulbs are gone. I think one of my little ones, the little tiny running lights might have gone in this, but I don't ride this at night anyway, but that's something I will get to. If you have one bike and it's your daily runner, if you have a bulb go, replace it. Even get a kit of bulbs for your bike before anything happens, so you've always got a spare one there, because trust me, it's a real pain if you have to go somewhere at night, you've only got one bike and your headlight bulb goes and you've got to somehow get a bulb, but you can't ride there because it's dark, and you can see where I'm going with this. Okay, continuing on, this actually is the same to do with the brakes really, but this is the top half. This is the master cylinder. This is what's full of fluid. You need to make sure by looking at the spyglass in here that not only your fluid is a nice colour, generally it's a light golden colour. If it's dark, then it's probably absorbed some water, it's got some dirt in it, it's got old, and it won't work as well. So you want to make sure that you have fresh brake fluid and properly primed with no air bubbles in it. The reason I'm not going into too much depth in each individual thing that you need to do is because basically I could teach you how to do it on this bike, but it would be different for your bike. So I'm here to teach you the basics, and then you can go off onto YouTube and look for the thing that you need to do for your bike. And you'll probably find someone's done it on your exact bike, and you can follow it step by step. But if you don't know the basics that you need to do, you won't know to look for that video, if you see what I mean. So that's why, as I say, I'm explaining these things, but not showing them to you exactly, because I'm expecting you to then move on to another video that will help you more directly. So yes, brake fluid is very, very important, and if you come around to changing your brakes and your pads, change your fluid at the same time. Just do it. It's not too expensive. You use a tiny amount here and whatever's in the line. On the other side, the clutch lever, depending on whether you have a hydraulic clutch or a cabled clutch, most bikes, a lot of bikes have cabled clutches. These need to be oiled, basically. You can get a little tool. I actually have a video on this in my videos for new riders playlist, which this will be in. You might find this useful. I've done a video on lubing cables. There's basically a little adapter thing that you can buy that you put on the end of here, and you can squirt GC85 down your lines, for instance, and it keeps them lubed and stops them from snagging and starting to fray and things like that. But that's another thing that you need to keep an eye on. If you pull this back here, you can see part of the cable. If that's frayed at all, buy a new cable. If you see any fraying, top or bottom of the end of cables, replace them. They are going to go. They're getting old. So continuing to move down, if your bike has a fuel filter, that's something that will need to be changed periodically, because it's saving the little bits of stuff going into your engine, but eventually that will get clogged up and that will stop the fuel getting into your engine anyway. So it's normally in line, take it out, put a fresh one in, if your bike has a fuel filter in line somewhere. The next thing down the bike is battery in most cases. If you don't use your bike a lot, or if you don't ride it during the winter, I really strongly advise that you get something like a battery tender, an optimizer, that just keeps the battery charged over the winter, because what will end up happening is it'll die. To my understanding, interestingly, batteries actually get killed in the summer in really hot heat when they get baked in the bike, and it's not until the winter that they start to show their problems. I don't know if that's true or not. It'd be very interesting if anyone can add anything to that. Either way, if your battery goes, it goes, whether it's hot or cold. But it seems to always happen during the winter. Totally forgot, of course, for the front, check your indicators are working. Same for the rear. And there's a quick way of checking everything on a bike. Just, turn it on, indicate left. It's easy if it's not sunny. Yep, we got flashing, indicate right. Flashing. Not flashing. There you go, perfect example. That was working a few days ago, and that one's stopped working. I'm guessing I've got a wire come loose. There you go, perfect example of just checking things over. You find these problems. That could have caused me some problems if I didn't know about that the next time I went for a ride. Yep, definitely not working. Anyway, continuing on. Hand over the rear brake, make sure you can see that the light is on slightly, pull the brake and you should see it flashing like that, and same for the rear. Yep, there you go. Headlight is easy to check, low beam, high beam. You notice I've got this bike on a paddock stand, so it's fully off the ground, so I can spin my rear wheel. That helps me be able to clean my chain, because if you haven't got one of those and you haven't got a centre stand, what you end up doing is rolling the bike backwards and forwards to clean it. Don't ever be tempted to run the bike in first, on the stand, and holding a brush onto it to clean the chain, anything like that. Don't think about it, don't do it. You will lose a finger. It doesn't take a lot for you to slip, and once your finger gets caught into that, it's not good. Don't do it. I know it's tempting to do it, but don't do it. equally, it makes it a lot easier to clean your wheels because you can sit there and clean them and then keep spinning them as you clean them. It makes things, as I say, a lot easier. If you haven't got a bike where you can lift it on a central stand like this, like a dirt bike, try and get some paddock stands which lift from the axles, or some bobbins or some points on the bike, or under the swing arm with little cups. Honestly, it saves you so much hassle being able to get the rear wheel off the floor when you need to do maintenance and cleaning and stuff like that. Front's not so important because it's quite accessible, the front, but again, if you need to take your front wheel off, then you will need something. Another option is you just lay the bike on its side on the ground, but it's not highly advised. Or another one to check, of course, is that your plate illumination light is working, which will be underneath your brake light, lighting up your plate. I have a very little one, but it's there. It counts. And that's basically it, I think. I can't think of anything that I've forgotten. You know, brake fluids on both cases, brake discs, pads, all the standard fare that you can probably think of. But if you think of the bike, as I say, in that lower half, upper half part, and you check through it, it will seem more natural. Obviously, if you're checking the tyres, you'll probably check the tyre, then the tyre, and go backwards and forwards. But I was showing you in a flow so you can go through it like I do. But obviously, brakes, it's all the same, but it's front and back. None of these jobs are particularly difficult, bar, say, changing the fork seals. I've done those on a 125 and they weren't too bad. I've seen these being done, doesn't seem to be too bad, but they can be quite complicated in some bikes. But otherwise, you'll only need basic tools to do all of these jobs. I have a video on a basic motorcycle toolkit. It's what I've basically got in mind. I've added to it as I've needed tools, and so I've shown you after a few years what I've accumulated and what I find useful the most. Again, that's another video which you'll find in the playlist about tips for new riders. And lastly is overall protection for the bike. That be clean it, keep it clean. You don't have to be fastidious about this because some grease on some things actually kind of protects it a little bit, but the best thing you can do is to keep the bike clean and keep it protected with something like ACF 50 or some other protective sprays. But ACF 50 is generally the very, well, thought to be one of the best ones, but it is very expensive. But it will stop any rust, any corrosion and stuff like that. Something that is used regularly, it stays a lot more up and together than something that's used and dumped for, you know, weeks or whatever at a time. I don't ride this bike all that often these days, especially while my back is bad at the moment, but this bike is absolutely perfect. I realised I hadn't started this in over a month and it started on the button first time and it feels absolutely fine. And I think that's testament to doing good general maintenance and just looking after a bike. Well, there we go. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to leave a like. Thank you to the sponsor of this video, AutoDoc. Check out the link in the description to their site if you need some car parts, and I'll catch you next time. Bye. If you enjoyed this video and the other content on the channel, please consider following the links in the description to show your support.